Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast, The Impact of ChatGPT on Talent Assessments, a panel discussion brought to you by Talogy. If you're watching this webcast via live stream on any of our social channels, you will need to view the archive recording on HR.com to receive credit. If you have any questions during the webcast, please click on Q&A in your webinar controls and type them in. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Danielle Desco to get us started.
Thank you so much, and welcome to today's panel discussion. ChatGPT and generative AI have been an emerging topic, growing interest every day. Today's panel will explore the implications of generative AI on talent assessment strategies. For today's panel discussion, we've collected experts from Talogy's R&D team. The R&D team is comprised of over 30 IO psychologists who are responsible for developing innovative assessments and development technology. Today's experts include Ted Kinney, who will be moderating the panel, Dan Hughes, Kimberly Silva, and Kristin Delgado. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ted.
Thanks, Danielle. It's a pleasure to host this discussion today. As Danielle said, I'm Ted Kinney. I'm in the R&D team at Talogy. And I'm really excited about the discussion today because we've pulled together some of the R&D team members that work closest in this area, are true experts with really diverse points of view, really diverse thoughts about where AI is going to go and what we can do and how it relates to organizational problems and how it can be applied effectively and some of the risks and challenges with AI in organizations. And so, I like this discussion because everybody on the panel are deep level experts. They don't always agree about everything, but I think that leads us to a fantastic discussion. And hopefully, I know that I am going to learn things through the discussion, and hopefully the discussion leads to a lot of good learning points for those of you that are attending. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be an exciting discussion. So we wanted to jump in first with just a general question about what is generative AI and how it's affecting organizations. We thought that starting with a little bit of a definition and talking about the particular AI areas of interest for the webinar would be a great place to start so that we all get on the same page about what we are talking about and what we aren't talking about. So with that, I'd like to ask Kristin if she could chime in and give us some thoughts about how you think of generative AI and provide a little bit of a definition for us to start with.
Thanks, Ted. Good morning, everybody, or I guess good afternoon. Yeah, so just really wanted to quickly kind of touch on what are we talking about when we're talking about generative AI. So AI, artificial intelligence, is pretty much what it sounds like. It's basically getting machines to mimic human behavior or human intelligence to perform some sort of task. Generative AI is a type of machine learning. So machine learning is these types of models that make predictions based on learning from data and kind of identifying patterns. The first machine learning models were to work with text were trained mostly to classify various inputs to the label set by the researchers. So for example, researchers would train a model to label social media posts as either positive or negative. This is an example of supervised learning because the human is in charge of teaching the model what to do. So then what comes next is the next generation of our text-based machine learning algorithms are classified as unsupervised learning. So this type of training involves feeding a model a massive amount of text so it's able to generate predictions. So for example, predictive text. So models can predict based on a few words how a sentence will end. And so with the right amount of the sample text, like the entire internet, the text models can become quite accurate, like what we're seeing with examples like ChatGPT. So generative AI is a branch of this AI intelligence that focuses on generating new content, such as images, text, even music, based on the patterns and examples that is learned from existing data. So, for example, a classic machine learning problem would be we start with the image of several types of cats. And then the program identifies which patterns among the images, and then scrutinize those random images, and then match, what that matched with a different cat. So generative AI, instead of just simply perceiving and classifying a data or like a photo in this example, it can create an image or a text description of a cat on demand. So, if you have, a generative AI model that's been trained on tons of different types of cat images, the model can learn the patterns, the features of those images, then generate a new cat image that could look like a real cat, even though it's not really a new cat. It could be a completely unique but realistic looking cat. So essentially, what we're talking about, generative AI models, they're like fed lots and lots of information, lots of existing content to produce new content, and they are able to they learn the underlying patterns of the data, but can actually become creative in it. And also, these models have random elements, so that means that they can produce a variety of different outputs from one input request. So you're in that way, the outputs can be very different multiple times that you're asking for the same thing. So as you can see, there's a lot of different, effects that, this type of technology has had on organizations. I mean, it can be used for creative purposes, obviously. So coming up with new designs, creating content for video games, music. It can, has implications in terms of like one of the biggest ones as far as like generative AI when we're talking about text-based is any type of of creating content, any type of text content. So any organization that needs to produce like some sort of clear written materials, potentially stand to benefit. So for like language models, we see opportunities for things like in translation, any type of creative or technical writing, code writing, any type of like grammatical correction analysis. Audio speech models can help with composing, dubbing, dictation, transcription, sound editing, things like speech and voice recognition. And the visual and imagery models can, have this opportunity for illustration, infographics, 3D modeling, any type of design or image editing, and then also we have like data generative models, which actually can create synthetic data from which we can use to train more AI models. So there's both. We're going to go into more specifics as far as like what kind of opportunities are going to be, available for HR specifically. But the potential opportunities are for all industries, I guess, across the board.
Yeah, I agree, Kristin. I mean, the opportunities for this new technology are seemingly boundless, and I know personally I've used it for everything from getting a good recipe to smoke ribs to creating paragraphs in the style of Civil War soldiers. And generative AI does all of these things with remarkable, results. It really is fascinating. But we wanted to focus our discussions today on the types of talent problems that we most often work with our clients on at Talogy, right? So we're going to focus our discussion on applications of generative AI, or discuss how generative AI impacts or might come into play with the types of talent challenges that we tend to work with. So in particular, we're going to focus our discussion on selection, risks and benefits. We're going to talk a little bit about how generative AI comes into play with development. And then we're going to talk a little bit too about how we see the proliferation of this technology perhaps impacting job design within organizations. Generative AI has tremendous applications for a lot of interesting purposes. We're going to focus today on thinking about how it relates to those selection, development, and job design talent challenges that we most often work with our clients. So from that perspective, wanted to jump in and get into some discussion around selection first. And the first question that we wanted to pose to the panel is, what risks do we see that are posed by generative AI in selection assessments? And so for this topic, I think Kim is going to start the discussion and share some of her thoughts about the risks that we see generative AI bringing to selection assessments.
Yes. So there are several risks that we often see that come out either in media or through blog posts, and these are things like bias, transparency, unreliable results. But in addition to those results, I wanted to talk about two that are a little bit more unique and pretty important to consider. And the first one is deepfakes. So deepfakes are a form of digital forgery, and they're highly realistic, altered copies of content. And typically a deepfake is used to pass misinformation, or to create confusion. And so in the context of job postings or assessments that could fool candidates. So fake postings or assessments that would allow the creator to gather candidates' personal information, their resumes, or other private data. And this poses a very high risk of identity theft, which is dangerous for the candidate, but it's also really dangerous for the reputation of the organization if this was to occur. The other one is fake job candidates that fool the organization. So fake applicants are able to use false identities or somebody else's identity to secure a job. And they could overwhelm the applicant system and prematurely fill spaces. And this is a real waste of companies' time, effort, resources, and it's quite unfair to real candidates. The second risk factor that I want to highlight is reverse engineering. And what reverse engineering might look like in the selection content is deconstructions to extract design information. And what we're worried about here is, first is intellectual property theft or infringement. And this could be theft of assessment materials, content, or even the scoring algorithms behind the assessment. And the other worry is candidate dishonesty by constructing tests and figuring out the target measure. So this is problematic for hiring with candidate cheating, but also it's difficult for assessment maintenance and for evaluation. So if we're basing off our assessment maintenance and evaluation off previous data, faked data could infiltrate and make that a big problem. And then the last is data security, because if candidates are using ChatGPT, now your items are now in the ChatGPT models. And I apologize, it seems like I'm freezing a little bit. So.
I think it's a deep fake, Kim. I suspect that's what's going on. But yeah, you are freezing a little bit. If you know, we'll see if it continues, but you know, it's not that distracting. But yeah. Were you finished with that point before I jumped in with my deep fake joke?
I got it.
Yeah. I think then I think we wanted to toss the question to Dan to talk about some of the other risks from his perspective that we see with generative AI.
Thanks, Ted. So I think the one that I really wanted to talk about, which is one that I think is coming up a lot, and we're seeing from organisations in the media, is around the risk of cheating with online assessments. So clearly generative AI is bringing it provides a new method that might be used by some candidates to try and cheat within a talent assessment process or game the process. Most immediately, maybe it appears that things like resumes, cover letters, competency-based application forms, so some of these upfront parts of the process, I think, are at most immediate risk because they involve candidates generating text in their own time without time limits, and they could use ChatGPT to support that. And then potentially it could be people could use them to try to cheat at online assessments as well. I think it's important, probably from the online assessment side, to just put into perspective that online unproctored assessments have always typically carried some risk of cheating. They could have someone completing it with them and the like, but this is you have to factor this alongside the benefits of being able to screen very high volumes of candidates. And we've sort of seen some of these concerns before, but they haven't proven so far to be a massive issue when you look at things like the reliability and validity that we see in assessments being used in selection processes. But that said, it's clearly it's a new risk that we'll have to consider, and organisations will have to consider with an assessment process design, and we'll need to monitor that impact. And in our own testing, we've been sort of looking at how it performs with different sorts of assessments. We found it doesn't tend to do that well, particularly with more of the sort of complex question formats, particularly where there's not just simple right wrong answers. And in those instances, we don't see it really creating a significant advantage. So, and you have to keep in mind what it's doing. It's not actually figuring out the right answer. It's searching vast amounts of text that it's got from the internet to find what's the most probable common text or answers that to give in response. And we found some in testing things like for cognitive ability and sort of reasoning, we already have some quite sophisticated formats that we can employ on that side with quite highly visual, interactive, sort of gamified cognitive ability assessments, which are collecting lots of response data over the course of assessment and how someone completes the task. And these sorts of sophisticated formats are pretty difficult for ChatGPT to be used with any kind of success at. And other formats, things like situational judgment tests, another the common format we found, that with a sort of a rating scale response approach like we use at Talogy, where it's gauging, you have to gauge the specific level of effectiveness or appropriateness of actions. ChatGPT tends to find that more challenging as well. And overall, I think there's various features that can be deployed to help to sort of mitigate this risk in assessment. And I think it also reinforces the value of combining lots of different assessments within an assessment process, which is what we've always recommended anyway. But it's going to continue to evolve, and clearly we need to be very conscious of that, and no doubt we'll need to sort of continue to evolve assessments in line over time to respond to things as they come up. And I guess just the last point I wanted to make, I think it's also worth just considering the perspective of, maybe accepting the reality that candidates have ChatGPT in an assessment process, and that they could use it in itself. I mean, so using ChatGPT effectively is likely to be a skill, or generative AI effectively is likely to be a skill that highly productive people will learn and demonstrate. So there's also just a perspective, and do you accept it as being part of the selection process? So if you go back many years ago, when we think about like numerical reasoning tests and things a long time ago, it's consideration about, do we let people use calculators? And nowadays that would seem like a sort of ridiculous suggestion necessarily. It's ubiquitous. Of course, people use calculators and can use them. So maybe in time, really, we need to just accept ChatGPT as being another tool that people can use, and that highly effective people will use to get their job done more productively.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I think you make some really good points to highlight. I think that the some of the deep fake types of topics that Kim talked about are fascinating to me and really interesting. But I admit that when I first learned about ChatGPT, that's where my brain went first. Is like, is this going to create a cheating risk? And thinking about that, I think you make some really key points that a lot of the anti-cheating types of mechanisms that we would put in place for unproctored internet testing tend to be pretty effective still with ChatGPT. And just like we didn't see reliability coefficients change or validity coefficients degrade as internet unproctored testing became ubiquitous, I expect the same will happen here too, particularly to reinforce what Dan said. If you're using assessments that are multi-method, that are designed for unproctored administration, there just really isn't a ton of advantage at this point that some of these generative AI tools are providing to assessment test takers. As Dan said, we got to monitor it. We got to keep looking at it. Got to keep in front of all of the latest trends. But I think that we're going to continue to see that it's not a problem that I initially immediately thought about when I first learned about ChatGPT. And then, the last point I'd make too is that when I did first learn about ChatGPT and jumped in and started entering personality items and the like into ChatGPT, the advice that it would give me about how to respond was the advice I would want, somebody to give a test taker. Things like ChatGPT saying, think about how you tend to behave over time setting and situations and answer along those lines, right? Like that's exactly what you should do when you answer a personality item. It wasn't providing the right answer, so to speak. So thus far, and again, we'll continue to monitor it, the risks in terms of cheating or validity of well-designed assessment measures tend to, I think, be relatively low at this point. So good discussion. Thank you, Dan and Kim. The next one, flipping the coin a little bit, thinking about what are the opportunities in selection with generative AI. And for this, I think we're going to start with Kim again. So Kim, could you give us some of your thoughts about the opportunities with AI, generative AI?
Absolutely. And please let me know if I freeze. And I'll turn off my camera. So I personally spend a lot of time in assessment design and evaluation. So one of the opportunities that I'm really excited about is using generative AI to create alternate forms. I will turn my camera off.
Yeah, I think it's better now, Kim. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. So one of the opportunities is creating alternate forms. So oftentimes when we have assessments, we want several versions of the same test to protect the content and for security reasons, but it can really be difficult to make those forms equivalent. And right now, what we commonly use is methods like IRT to help us create those parallel forms. But there's a lot of opportunity of using generative AI or other language models that are contextually similar, and this will help aid in the equivalence challenges that we have. A second opportunity that I'm very excited about is just a new way to measure existing constructs that are historically very difficult to capture. So if we're able to incorporate generative AI or ChatGPT, anything like that, into our assessments, we could take advantage of free-flowing conversations and chatbots with a natural cadence that might help us capture a cleaner and more rich measure and a diverse measure of constructs that we've been interested in for a very, very long time. So imagine things like creativity. The last opportunity that I personally love is automating repetitive tasks. So generative AI is very useful in speeding up things like coding or smaller writing tasks that are very repetitive. And what that does is that allows us to free up more time and more space for innovation and coming up with more solutions to creative problems, because we're no longer bogged down by the things that take up a lot of time that are very important, but very repetitive. So those are my 3 favorite opportunities for generative AI.
Yep. Thank you, Kim. And I think that Kristin, you had some thoughts too about some of the opportunities generative AI brings to selection assessment.
Sure. One of the quick wins, is lies in the scoring of our assessments. So, and these types of tech will allow us to analyze video interviews and text written answers, assessment center exercises, case studies, stuff like that. It has the ability to transform how, the traditional psychometric constructs that we measure with, like personality or SJT. You can use a more interactive, discursive approach instead of that traditional fixed format questionnaire. It enables a scalable analysis across multiple assessment inputs. And it can you can use this AI to kind of drive the selection of the best combinations of those modes, and more move towards a more customized solution instead of like the traditional one size fits all approach. It also allows us to improve the reporting and feedback, so we can offer candidates more insightful, relevant recommendations and feedback. Where it gives us the potential to kind of consolidate all the data from those multiple assessment tools and deliver some valuable feedback with that's going to be more affordable, I guess, in the long run. And it doesn't need to be restricted to the traditional formats, but more conversational in nature. And so what that does is just provide better applicant experience. One of the other things that I think this type of technology does, one of the things that's very good at is tagging. So it's very good at gives us the ability to tag unstructured data for words. And so when you're looking at it from a talent acquisition lens, you're looking for specific capabilities. Now you don't need to look for specific credentials or degrees. You could look for keywords in terms of what are those capabilities? What are those skills? How do we talk about certain capabilities? There might be certain words to associate with those who have those skills. And now you will be able to find those folks without relying on specific degrees. So that actually kind of ties into what Kim was just speaking about. So when we're trying to measure things like dark traits, we're trying to measure things like intolerance, cultural intolerance. These things are very difficult to kind of pick up on, especially they're transparent and in traditional type of testing. Are we able to kind of glean some more information from our conversations, interviews, or open text answers to kind of pick up and flag those individuals that might be using certain terminology or having certain responses to some of our assessments. So it allows us a lot more range of kind of what kind of constructs we can tap into. So yeah, I think those are some really exciting possible developments that we hope to use in our technology, Talogy.
Yeah, and I think that Kim and Kristin, you both hit on an idea that I think is really interesting. I think that a lot of assessments include situational judgment these days, and when you think about the nature of situational judgment testing, they are intended to be a simulation of sort. Like, let's say you're measuring teamwork with a situational judgment item. You provide a scenario, and then you either ask the participant to pick a response or to rate from several possible responses the effectiveness of it. But it is fundamentally different than how teamwork occurs on the job, right? And so I've always sort of thought that it would be better if you could have situational judgment in a way that mimics an interaction in a workplace. And so I think that we'll see as this technology advances ways to provide those types of prompts where generative AI is carrying on the situation in sort of a situational judgment scenario. So I think that's an interesting line of thought that I've thought a little bit about. And it's related, I think, to a question that I saw come into the chat where somebody asked about using AI in complex assessment centers and with role play exercises. And absolutely, I think there's a place. Like having designed lots of role plays in the past, one of the challenges that you always have is in training the role players about which prompt to go to next or where they should go based on the response. And you can just see how this technology could actually help us drive more structure and more standardization in how a role play might progress. So I think these are all new areas of inquiry, and I think that we'll see a lot of advancement in designing some of these more simulation-based types of assessment predictors in the future. So I think with that said, as we're talking about role plays and assessment centers, things that are oftentimes used for development, it's a good segue into our next topic that I think Dan is going to start us off with. And that is how we can leverage generative AI in development applications.
Thanks, Ted. Yeah, this has been an area that I've been particularly interested in, particularly do a lot of work around psychometric assessment and other assessments for development purposes, and how we can help people take those insights, learn and develop from them. I think a couple of points I wanted to make around this, a couple of ideas and thoughts. I think one that I've found particularly interesting and have been sort of experimenting with, and I know others are exploring this route as well, is around using generative AI for sort of digital AI-based coaching. It's been quite fun to experiment with this. I think you can get quite variable results depending on what sort of generative AI tool you're using. But I think it's really interesting because it could provide some of these benefits of coaching at a much greater scale than is possible with human coaches, and could potentially be quite useful for very sort of targeted, narrow coaching that's focused on a specific work challenge, or maybe helping someone pick up on something from a talent assessment that they've done for development, and maybe as an area they want to develop. So I think what we found as we've been sort of experimenting is it can work quite well for that quite narrow sort of focus on a specific challenge. I think at the same time, we didn't anticipate it would be replacing human coaching, because generative AI doesn't truly have empathy or emotional intelligence, or necessarily it won't have the deeper understanding of the contextual nuances of someone's role, the organization, the challenges, and the sort of background to it. So while I think it's it could potentially be quite helpful, and it could bring some of the benefits of coaching to a much wider audience. There's some really interesting work going on in this area. I'd see it more at this point. It's more of a supplement to human coaching, and a way of adding beyond that, or giving democratizing sort of access to coaching where it wouldn't be available. So that was one area. I think then on another aspect that we've been sort of exploring, I think others are again as well, is it's more of a sort of on the spot, generative AI being more of an on the spot co-pilot to sort of support continuous learning and development on a more of a sort of micro scale. So for example, it could just be something even as simple as providing with some quick tips about things to try to, I don't know, like give me 3 things to develop my teamwork skills, for example, or communication, or things like that. So giving you some tips in the moment and very quickly. Or it could be looking at doing things like reviewing content that you've written to make suggestions on how that content can be made more impactful or engaging, so improving sort of communication skills as well. So I think these sort of on the spot, very sort of micro scale learnings could be quite helpful for. I think the pros and some of the pros and cons here are actually with some of these tools, it could almost make some people lazy, because you almost become over reliant on the AI making suggestions and improvements to, I don't know, to sort of written content, rather than actually really reflecting on what you're learning from what it's done, how it's improved it, and using it to actually identify and improve maybe how you write things, for example, later on. So I think there's some pros and cons here in terms of it. It could be a really useful tool for learning, could also make some people lazy if they rely on it too much.
Yeah, great points, Dan, for sure. And I think, it really seems like an area where I would encourage people to get creative and look at it. And as long as you don't do what Dan said, becoming too reliant on it, you can really find some interesting things out. Now, like as an example of that, I think ChatGPT launched on November 30th. I think that Dan had a working feedback coach with generative AI by about December 7th, right? So like now Dan knows a little bit more than the average person about development, but it really can be a useful tool that if you get creative and leverage it, that you can create some really powerful things for your organizations from a development perspective. Kristin, I think you also had some thoughts about leveraging generative AI for development.
Yeah, I think there are several, some of the things that I've seen at least in the literature, from the limited amount of research that's come out. So one of the things that they're seeing that, generative AI can be particularly good at is getting, new workers more up to speed quickly. So, with onboarding, there's been some research out of MIT that found that, the generative AI functionality wasn't really that helpful for experienced folks, but was very helpful for getting, the new folks up to speed, that were able to get that institutional knowledge much more quickly, able to answer questions around like company policies, benefits, any type of support guidance that you would need when you're, kind of the new person on the job. Dan, touched on, the personalized employee development. So, AI allows us to kind of take this vast amount of data and analyze it and kind of come up with some sort of recommendations that could help with, using like performance metrics, skills assessment, career aspirations, that type of thing, and provide data-driven insights and objective evaluations for things like performance management, being able to kind of, offer training recommendations, identifying those skill gaps. It can help like assist in, giving some really useful performance review, feedback, and as well as performance monitoring, and kind of like dealing with, helping us kind of deal with any type of performance issues. Another area I see this type of technology could be very useful is around, employee engagement, and, culture, organizational culture. So, being able to kind of, for organizations to implement like some sort of like concrete actions or initiatives to kind of like impact employee motivation and engagement, it can be difficult because, there's a lot of different sources that we might get this information from. And, generative AI can help us, look at, results of internal surveys, individual interviews, kind of detect the trends that are like around the factors that are influencing employee engagement. It can help the organizations identify areas for improvement and like where they need to implement targeted initiatives to increase engagement. It would be able to help us analyze employee data and preferences to kind of offer those personalized benefits, as we mentioned already. It could help as well to help develop recognition and reward systems that take into account, individual and organizational employee preferences, motivations. What are the different types of rewards that, are most appreciated and most effective in encouraging, better performance, more engagement, and, so we can create these more attractive, stimulating reward programs. Generative AI could also help us, monitor and evaluate corporate culture. So looking at, these data for different sources, like we said, internal surveys, meetings, interactions between employers, identifying kind of the positive and negative aspects of corporate culture, helps us kind of like target in on those, what could be some changes. Another area that we have, like we are hoping to leverage this type of tech would be, in employee well-being. Generative AI can help us, analyze data from all these different sources, feedback surveys, manager feedback, performance indicators, and hopefully provide customized recommendations, kind of tailor programs and real-time monitoring to prevent things like burnout. So looking at data on workload, overtime, stress levels. These generative AI could help identify employees at high risk of burnout. That can be useful for reducing turnover. Also any type of safety incidents. So there's lots of different areas that kind of being able to identify, take all this data that we have and make sense of it and provide some sort of relevant, targeted type of intervention that would help kind of the organization reach those goals that are important.
Yeah, and then there are just really simple applications that all of you can do tomorrow, right? That, as an example, I have a coworker who had to provide some critical feedback to a person on their team, and they did not want to, provide the feedback in an unhealthy or unproductive way, and so they went to ChatGPT, explained the feedback they wanted to give, asked ChatGPT to write 3 different responses, and then this person was able to take from the bits and pieces of each and provide a really wonderful message that was developmentally focused and yet communicated the information they needed. So that's something that we all could do tomorrow. And I think that example really feeds into the next question that we wanted to talk a little bit, because ChatGPT is a resource. It is available on the job. And so with that coming onto the job, it can in some ways change our job design. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about, with this technology's presence in our lives, how does it change jobs? How does it change the attributes that predict performance that we should be measuring? And so I know that the team has some thoughts about this idea. I think first, Dan, you were going to talk a little bit on the topic.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ted. Yeah. I mean, I think I guess the short answer to this question is yes. It is going to change the nature of jobs and work. This is inevitable. I think so. We're going to see new jobs emerge. Jobs will change. There'll be, I think, significant upskilling, reskilling in different roles. And I mean, for me, generative AI is a prime example of some of the advanced technology that the World Economic Forum has been referring to for the last 5 years. So when they've been speaking about how the fact we're in a 4th industrial revolution of the sort of advanced technology, I think. So this is really where, to me, this year, where maybe this has really hit home for a lot of people as they see these this sort of advanced technology permeating more through their lives. And the future of jobs report that the World Economic Forum produce, and they released a new report this year. They sort of do it every few years. I think it's really interesting read for anyone that wants to explore this topic. I mean, some of the statistics I picked out from there. So 75% of organisations saying they're likely or highly likely to adopt AI over the next 5 years. So there'll be a lot of adoption. 42% of business-related tasks are expected to be automated in the next 5 years, and that's increased. Talk about many jobs being lost, but at the same time, we're talking about 69 million types of new jobs being created. And then even within jobs as well, that on average, we're estimating like 44% of the core skills in roles are expected to change in the next 5 years. So some quite substantial shifts and changes for a lot of jobs. But I think it's also important to note it's probably being seen. Certainly in a lot of things I've read around, it's more about augmentation of what people could do rather than necessarily about automation entirely. So it could actually help to augment our jobs. It could help to take away some of the more routine elements that can be automated and allow humans to focus on actually some of the more interesting and creative aspects of their jobs. And And I think with all of this change as well, it's going to mean that there's potentially some specific attributes that we might want to focus on more. It might be that things we're more interested in measuring in an assessment process, things that will demand things from certain people. So it's likely that there's certain competencies that are going to become more important in order for people to take advantage of generative AI in our day-to-day work, and it's going to become, to me, as a sort of essential thing we'll all need to take on board. And we conducted research actually a few years ago into the future of work, and I think the competencies we highlighted then really still stand. So I think there's some key competencies which are quite cognitive in nature. So I'd pick out things like critical thinking. I think this is my number one competency or skill, because I think a lot of this application of things like generative AI will require critical thinking into understanding the right questions to ask, the right prompts to give, but then also at the same time to be able to have the critical thinking to evaluate how good is the response that you get back. So there's been plenty of talk about sort of the idea of hallucinations with generative AI, or can give very bold but wrong responses to questions, and actually having that critical thinking to know, well, is that actually a good response, or how does it need to be tailored? But also other cognitive competencies like learning agility. Things are going to change very rapidly, things are going to evolve very rapidly, and going along with that and having the sort of the ability to learn quickly and adapt to that will be important. Also, digital dexterity sort of goes without saying, that sort of being skillful with the technology and digital functionality that we have at our fingertips, but also creativity and innovation as well. So generative AI is learning from what's gone before, but that does put maybe more emphasis on humans to actually bring the more creative part, thinking about things that haven't even happened yet, or applications or the like to that's where humans can actually maybe bring in an extra element. And as well as those cognitive competencies, I think there's also more what I'd say is sort of attitudinal competencies, like how we cope with this change, because it's happening right now. So I think competencies like change orientation, resilience, adaptability, having a sort of attitude towards sort of lifelong personal development, I think those elements will be really important as well. How do you embrace the change? How do you make it work for you? How do you develop to and evolve what you do to respond to that? So I think all of those areas are going to be really important, both these more cognitive competency and then the sort of attitudinal side. And my prediction, I think that, I mean, those aren't necessarily new. Creativity and innovation isn't a new thing. Critical thinking isn't a new thing, but then there'll be maybe more emphasis on them in years to come, and maybe a bit more focus on them as they come more to the fore.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I know, Kim, you had some other thoughts too about some of these attributes.
Yep, I 100% agree with Dan that jobs are going to change, and with that change, the attributes we measure as well. And I believe that there will be more focus on some of the traditional attributes or competencies that we already measure. But I think generative AI also sparked interest in new or less common attributes. And there are 4 of them that I think that are going to be key in our future assessments. The first one that I have is foresight. So foresight is the ability to anticipate potential outcomes and consequences of decisions, even in the face of uncertainty. So if we have tools that easily provide us with lots of information, lots of different ways to solve problems or complete tasks, we'll want people who are able to consider the long-term implications of those options and be very specific about the task so that they can make really informed decisions. The second one is self-awareness, and specifically the skill within self-awareness that allows us to reflect and question and challenge our own thoughts and opinions and feelings. And this will allow someone who is high in this, they would be able to see multiple perspectives and ask for multiple perspectives and really get to the why behind the generative AI responses. So understanding not only what the response is, but why that is the response that you got. And is it worthwhile? The third big one is identifying bias. So we all know, and we have seen time and again, that generative AI tools have bias. So I think a attribute or competency that we'll be looking for is the ability to look at content and then pinpoint where that bias is. And once you find where it exists, how can it be corrected? And then the last one that I think is important and will become even more important is deep content knowledge. So generative AI tools, when you're using them, they will give you information based on what you ask of it. So it will become very, very important for the user to know whether the information provided completely covers the topic that they're asking about. And when they do get those responses, are they missing concepts? Is there other ideas that need to be questioned and explored further? Or if any of the information is simply wrong. So knowing or having deep domain knowledge is going to be very, very important when we start using these generative AI tools more and more.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think that's a great point. And, when I reflect on Kim and Dan's thoughts, it always brings me back to the idea that technology and tools are changing, the job designs are changing, but the attributes on which people vary are not changing, right? The personality and the composition of our brains is not changing, right? And so the measures that we get from our assessments today are still measuring the attributes on which people vary. And as jobs change in the face of this new technology, the trick is to just understand how those attributes change in predicting those attributes, or the new job design. And I think that what we're seeing is, things like job knowledge, critical thinking, self-awareness, resilience. A lot of the predictors that work today are still going to work. We'll change our weightings, we'll change the way that we consider them, we'll change the collections that we bring traits into to form competencies. But by and large, a well-developed scientific assessment is still going to work to predict performance in the job designs to come. So that's, I think, while there's a lot of change going on with technology, that's at least one optimistic thought. We don't have to get rid of our selection programs in the face of generative AI. We just need to continue to evolve them, be innovative, and continue to improve. With that said, I thought that we did want to cover just one topic. We're running a little bit short on time, but I think the area of regulations, I think, is something that we should talk at least for a brief minute about, because as technology changes so drastically, and as we see in the media and the popular press so much time spent discussing generative AI, and it's a salacious topic, and there's a lot of discussion about it in the public square. I think the topic of regulations is important to consider, particularly as we see in the US on July 5th, the New York City local law 144 became effective and enforced. I think that's an example of a regulation that related to AI, that's looking at automated employment decision tools. And I think at this stage, there's just a lot that we don't know. Like, if you think about that law in particular, it's not clear about what is an automated employment decision tool. It's not clear about how it's going to be evaluated, and it's going to take case law and a lot of time to figure all of that out. So my point in this discussion is really just to say, you got to keep your eye on this. Regulations are going to come as it relates to generative AI. There's going to be discussions about it. And as you think about how this might apply in your organization to your talent challenges, you should at least have some looking into an investigation on regulations that are coming out. I would say I'm encouraged by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's statement on that New York City law. They came out and basically said that we are going to continue to enforce the uniform guidelines and the related case law that's come out since the uniform guidelines. And I suspect that's what we're going to see as generative AI regulations come out as well. That the concepts like validity, the concepts like job relatedness, concepts like fairness and adverse impact are still going to be important. We're going to always have to evaluate our tools based on those tried and true, metrics of effective selection interventions, right? So I think that this is an area that's going to be important. I think, Dan, the EU has said some similar statements, or they're looking into it at any rate.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess one of the key ones I've probably got my eye on is the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, which is so that's a new proposed European law that's again is focusing on things like the sort of ethical application, human-centered application of AI, which I think at the moment they're potentially expecting the final act to be adopted towards the end of this year, and that would put in it's a sort of different tiering of sort of the level of risk of different applications, but it would mean things like, I don't know, something like automated CV scanning would potentially be classified as a sort of high risk AI, and therefore would come with legal requirements and conformity, a need for sort of conformity assessment. So it will certainly bring in more requirements for compliance for systems that are being used with EU citizens, but hopefully should also just help to address some of these potential ethical risks that I think we've got at the moment with the application of AI and not having these regulations in place.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And so those were all of the questions that we had. There's not a ton of time for additional questions. I know Danielle, you just popped up on my screen. Did you have any that you wanted to
Honestly,
share?
a lot of the questions we've kind of covered already. I think we did a really great job of looking at the chat during the presentation. Just one interesting comment I'd like to say that I was looking on LinkedIn because we're broadcasting this live on LinkedIn, and someone chimed in that they use ChatGPT to help write their job postings in the HR community, and they use it as a baseline. They're still going and editing, but it gives people a place to start. I thought that was just really interesting that we're using, a lot of people in the HR community are using ChatGPT and generative AI to make their jobs easier. It's not replacing roles, but it's being used as a tool, just as I think maybe Dan said, like calculators were at one point, right? So I just thought that was really interesting. So I think with that, we'll end the presentation. But if anyone has questions or wants access to our experts, you can go to Talogy.com. You could just simply fill out a contact us form and we can continue this conversation. But yeah, thank you so much to the panelists. This was a really great discussion, really interesting. And as we said, it's always evolving. So with that, I'll turn that back to Kathy and HR.com.
Thank you. This concludes our webcast today. I would like to thank all our presenters, as well as all of you for joining us. If you joined late and would like to view the webcast again, the recording will be available on HR.com on our archived webcast page. Please take a few moments and fill out the webcast survey that will open on your screen. Your feedback is very important to us. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy.